Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the first morning of the second day of the Halifax International Security Forum. I'm Lise Doucette, I'm BBC correspondent, I'm Canadian, and most importantly, I'm from the Maritimes. And so I should welcome, bonjour to General Palermo's, good morning to General Perkins. Irakli Alasanya, how do you say good morning in Georgian?
Ilam Shudobis. Dilam Shudobis.
And
I have to train for that.
Fatima Hastabakar, how do you say it in Kurdish?
Beani Bash.
See? It's 8:40 a.m. and you have already learned two new things here at the Halifax International Security Forum. But to the question of the day, is winning possible? The laws and lawlessness of asymmetric war. What do we mean by asymmetric war? It's a kind of warfare that has been around for centuries, and some would say millennium. But it is the war of our time. There are far more asymmetric wars now than the more classic wars between nation states. And what is asymmetric war? Remember, we used to call it guerrilla warfare? It sounds almost quaint now. We also have, of course, insurgencies and terrorism, although some would say that terrorism is not asymmetric warfare per se. Let's establish the ground on which we are going to discuss it. Can I have from the audience perhaps 3 examples of what comes to, each person giving one, of what comes to mind when you think asymmetric war? What's an asymmetric war from your point of view now? Hands up and the microphones are coming around. Very quickly, we only have an hour. No one has an asymmetric war they're thinking about this morning? In the back.
Non-state actors like ISIS.
Give me ISIS, okay, so the war in Syria and Iraq. Another asymmetric war of our time. Does anyone have an example? Right here.
Lady.
Josh Rogan, here.
Anti-satellite lasers.
Interesting. One last example, just to give us food for thought. Here.
Palestine versus Israel.
Palestine versus Israel. Or you saw in the video there some 2 questions we can discuss in this hour. What does it take to win an asymmetric war? And what does winning look like? And as the session has asked us to consider, what is the relationship between the laws and the lawlessness of asymmetric war? And on this point, I would urge you to read the excellent essay in your pack from Janice Stein from the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. And I quote from her, "Today, the prize goes to the side that can shape the story," so it's about perceptions as well, "and claim legitimacy. And in that struggle, the laws of war are a weapon." You heard in the video the man saying, "Where is my wife? Where are my children? Where do I go?" That is sadly one of the cries that you hear in the asymmetric wars of our time. It's a new way of fighting war in a different way, and it's a war that is on our minds, on the minds of all of us. It is a question of doctrine. So we're very fortunate to have 4 gentlemen with us who think a lot about these sorts of wars. Right next to me, Jean-Paul Palomeros, who's the Supreme Allied Commander for Transformation with the North Atlantic Training and Doctrine Command. He's a French fighter pilot. He's a former Chief of Staff for the French Air Force. And parce qu'il est français, il se bat pour la liberté as well. Because he's French, he fights for liberty. We also have General Perkins, who joins us he's the Commanding General of the United States Army Training and Doctrine Command. He tells me, and I confirmed with him, he has to recruit and train every single US soldier. He has to train the Army professionals. He has to think about the future of the American Army. And on his long list of engagements, I noted that he was one of the commanders for the invasion of Iraq. And of course, that is a war that morphed from a war between conventional armies into the war that we see today. Irakli Alasanya, when you look at his CV, he's been fighting asymmetric wars and diplomacy all of his life. He was the Minister of Defense in Georgia, but was relieved of his post just a few weeks ago. He resigned in 2008 as the ambassador of Georgia to the United Nations. He was part of the Georgia Dream coalition that swept to power in 2012 and now heads his own political party in Georgia. Last but not least, Fala Mustafa Barker joins us. He's from Kurdistan. He is the head of the Foreign Relations Department there and has served in many roles in Kurdistan. And you will note that he has a degree from the University of Harvard, the University of Bath, the University of Mosul. Sadly, a university he cannot visit today, and Mosul will be on our minds. Let's begin to look at the doctrine, at how you fight these asymmetric wars and fight them if you hope to win, if winning is indeed possible. General Perkins, you have the advantage or disadvantage of heading the biggest, most powerful army in the world. What kind of issues do you think about when you think about fighting asymmetric wars?
As you said, one of the responsibilities for the team that I work with is we write doctrine for the United States Army, and we think about the future, and we think about really the essence of war. And when you use the word asymmetry, sometimes I think we misunderstand it as it is something new and different, where really war has always been a battle of asymmetries. That's really the definition of war. You had bow and arrows, and then you had musket loaders. And then we went from musket loaders to breech-loading rifles. Then we went from rifles to machine guns to tanks, to anti-tank weapons, general purpose, conventional war, nuclear war. So you're always at a battle of asymmetries. And so in the world that I live in, doctrine, words have meanings. And we try to define them so that you have an accurate description and visualization about war. And so we define asymmetry as the process of thinking, organizing, and acting differently in order to maximize your advantage, to exploit an enemy's weakness, to gain the initiative. And so that is what war is. You are constantly trying to think, organize, and act differently to maximize your advantage, to exploit your enemy's weakness, to get initiative, to gain freedom of action. So war, by our definition, is asymmetric. All war is asymmetric. We tend to think asymmetry from the point of view of a weaker versus a stronger army, but not always so. If you have nuclear weapons and your opponent doesn't, that's an asymmetric capability. That is something different that your strength you can maximize against their weakness. But if you do think sometimes traditionally when they think of asymmetry as maybe the weaker against the stronger, people, as you say, tend to look at the U.S. now as maybe on the one side of that. But this coming year, the U.S. Army will be 240 years old. And in 1775, we were kind of on the opposite end of that relationship with the British. At that time, probably one of the most powerful land armies in the world, and we were seen probably as an asymmetric threat to them. So what George Washington and the Continental Army did is said, how can I leverage my advantage of being much smaller than the British Army, not nearly as well trained, et cetera, and so use different types of maneuver, use different types of formation, wore different kinds of uniforms. And so the American Army is very familiar with asymmetry, and we've sort of been on both sides of it. But from a macro point of view, we are always trying to think through what is it that we can leverage to our advantage and what weakness of the enemy can we exploit. So it's constant, and it is constantly changing almost daily.
But as you say, it's always been with us right back to the days of the bow and arrow. But does Josh mentioned about cyber satellites and the fact that the internet is now part of the equation, where you don't need a lot of money, you don't have to be that powerful to actually send your message around the world. Is it a whole new playing field, or battlefield, if you like?
Well, what we're finding is some of the things that used to give us an asymmetric advantage may not have the same quality. And what we also find is in different domains, for instance, different types of things give you an asymmetric advantage. In the aerospace domain, the space domain, the cyber domain, technology does tend to have a quality of its own with regards to asymmetry. I operate mainly in the land domain. And we find that as you close with the enemy and war becomes much more personal, technology generally doesn't give you as much as an asymmetric advantage as does leadership, training, discipline. Those things give you an asymmetric advantage. So in the United States Army, our number one priority is actually not the new tank or the new aircraft. We will get a new tank for that. The number one priority for the Chief of Staff of the Army is leader development. Because we've said in the domain that we operate in, the biggest asymmetric advantage that U.S. Army soldiers have is they are better trained and led and disciplined than their enemy. And that will offset numbers or any of the other things. And we think that's our asymmetric advantage that is very difficult to get on the internet, and you can't buy that on the arms market.
Okay, leadership will be a point we want to pick up, I think, in the questioning. And General Allen tomorrow will be telling us that the fight against so-called Islamic State is also a fight against ideas. So it's not just a question of leadership, it's also about leadership and the narrative. But we're going to stay with that.
That's an asymmetry.
Yeah. General Polaros, we heard a lot about transformation during the Afghan war, that NATO had to transform itself to fight the kind of war in Afghanistan. Is reading the New York Times today to say that Obama has secretly, I got the senators in the front row, I have to be very careful in the Congress, has secretly extended the military mission in Afghanistan because it's turning out to be a long, difficult fight against the Taliban in the way that the Taliban fight. When you sit down now in Norfolk and think about transformation and you think about the threats posed by these asymmetric battles, what is it that is on your mind and how you're going to shape the alliance of NATO powers?
Perhaps it is a wonderful opportunity in Halifax again to put the question in a wider context. If we look to the world of the end of the 20th century and certainly the world in which we live today, what we call asymmetry is more about unconventional and even more about unrestricted warfare. I mean that we are facing threats, adversaries, enemies that are not complying, that are not accepting the rules of the game. The words as it was defined after the Second World War, as we saw, the laws of war, the laws of armed conflicts, which, by the way, has been defined through the years. The last time was 1977, including non-state actors, including non-international wars. So, first and foremost, I don't see the need to change the laws. We need to adapt. We need to understand that our potential adversaries will not comply, and therefore, we must imagine how we can fight those wars, how we build the coalition of willing, the coalition of commitment with different countries, different group of countries. Would it be NATO, 28 countries, assembled by the same values for 65 years, very successfully, understanding that NATO is not only today about only collective defense, that collective defense is as well about some crisis management, depending on the international will to do that. And we need to win as well the will, the hearts of mind and minds, not only abroad, but in our own countries to fight those unrestricted wars. And perhaps this is the main challenge that we have to face today.
It's interesting, the unrestricted war, of course, in political dialogue, it would be called the long war, the war without end, which I think is the fear of every government who cannot sustain the cost of, look at the air campaign and look at what's happening in Kobane, which for me, as a journalist, as a viewer, is an extraordinary example of unequal war or asymmetric warfare, is that you have the might of some of the most powerful air forces in the world, both Arab and Western, against a fighting force. Granted, they have some advisors from the Iraqi army, but an unconventional fighting force in front of the world's cameras. And even though the Islamic fighters have been stopped from taking Kobane, they haven't lost it. And it's been months, months. Do you see that as an example of the kind of battle that you're forced to fight and can't win as quickly and as easily as you would like?
First and foremost, you are forced to fight a battle if you are not able to anticipate the battle. So the best way to fight a battle is to be better in anticipating and taking the consequences of what we see, what we feel, the weak signals that we have. We were not able to do that for ISIL. Again, I would say. Neither in the
It's a question
Balkans.
of planning. You can't, here
So-
two gentlemen are looking at the futures of the army, and you don't even know, you can't really say what the threats are going to be.
Secondly, we have to use the best tools that we have in our inventory. I remember last year and the year before here in Halifax, we discussed the benefit, the limits, and the psychological effect of drones, armed drones. Should we discuss that today against ISIL? No, because we have to use the best tools that we have to force the victory. And those tools are very relevant to what we see today. But the most outstanding factor in the winning, the assessment of the winning in those conflicts is the resilience. And not only the resilience of our forces, the resilience of our will, our politicians, of our society, of our economy. But can we afford to lose? What is that price too high? To fight for values, to fight for the future security environment of the world? I would say, yes, we are spending flying hours, but we are spending that very wisely, with more precision, with more effectiveness. We will win.
Very interesting way to put the question, can we afford to lose? Because this is not just a battle far away, this is a battle that comes all the way back home, including here in Canada. Let's bring it down to the level of a concrete war. Fatih, I know you're not, you're on the civilian side, but of course we all know about the Kurdish Peshmerga fighters who are part of the array of forces of the Iraqi army, so part of more conventional warfare, but of course they have a unity and a sense of purpose all of their own, and they're very much in the eyes of the world right now. How would you discuss what is happening now in Kurdistan?
Well, to ask the question whether winning is possible, yes, indeed it's possible, but you have to have a strategy and you have to talk about the wider context. For us, we are fighting ISIS not only on the Iraqi territory, but we are fighting them on the Syrian territory as well. So therefore, they have got a depth of supply line and recruitment. Even if you defeat them in one place, then they would have a supply in another place. So therefore, for them, we have to have a strategy regionally and internationally. We are yet to get that international coalition to be strong enough and to have a clear strategy and vision. What do we want to achieve? Are we all on board of defeating ISIL? For us, as far as the Kurds are concerned, we are determined to fight them and to defeat them. And thanks to the American airstrikes and the international coalition that has been formed, the balance of power changed with the airstrikes in the immediate days. First, they came in June. Then in August, they attacked Kurdistan region. They were able to gain control of territory. But it needed few days for us to be able to think about a new strategy, because for us, that was a new war. It was indeed asymmetric because they had a strategy of fear, and they used technology and this media and social media in the best possible way to frighten people and create panic among the people. And we needed to have a strategy and a plan. We had a twofold plan. One, to stop their advances, and second, to think about being on the offensive. We were able to stop their advances, and thanks to the airstrikes, we were able to be on the offensive. And today, I can tell you that we have regained control over all the territory that we lost to them in August, with the exception of Sinjar, which is on the Syrian border. And now we are preparing the ground for a plan in order to take it back. But indeed, for them, they don't have any respect for any value, any rules of engagement, any respect for prisoners of war. Therefore, it is not an easy war. It is, we call them the terrorist organization of the Islamic State. They are terrorists, but indeed, the problem is that for us, the Peshmergas who were fighting in the mountain, we used to a guerrilla type of war. The Peshmergas are a light infantry troop with small and light arms and ammunition. Therefore, for them to have captured American advanced weaponry from the Iraqi army, it was not easy. There was disparity between the capabilities of ISIS and the capabilities of the Peshmerga. But at the end of the day, we won the battle. We have defeated them. Now they are thinking about sending suicide bombers. We are in a front line. In Rabi'a, just last week, we regained control of Rabi'a last month, but last week they again had an attack. They brought Humvees, and they had 4 suicide bombers to come to the battlefront. Therefore, it's not easy. Sometimes they raise the white flag, as if they are surrendering, then all of a sudden explodes and kills your Peshmerga. So therefore, it is a different war, and it is a difficult war to fight, but winning is possible. For them, you mentioned Kobani. Kobani became the symbol of resistance for us. Therefore, the Kurdish Peshmergas were sent from Iraq via Turkey to Kobani to help and not to allow that to fall. Thanks to the international coalition, before the coalition and before the airstrikes, almost they had 70 to 80% of the Kobani under their control. Today, it's the other way around, 70 to 80% of Kobani under the Kurdish control. Therefore, for them also it became a symbol, that's why they are fighting for it. They are bringing a lot of troops in there. But another thing, they are using human shields. I saw it in the film. They are bringing some families and children to certain areas to show the airplanes that there are families and civilians. Of course, the coalition is committed to human rights principles and respect. They don't shell and they don't bombard these areas. But they are starting from there attacking us. So therefore, it is a very difficult war, in addition to be different, but it's also difficult.
So you see it as an example of an asymmetric warfare. You mentioned a few times that you think the strategy is in place. Is it the right strategy? Because there are many who argue that the battle can only be won in a more conventional way with troops, with boots on the ground, which of course the Western nations and Arab nations have said they're not willing to do that.
Well, the strategy is there, but it has to be more clear. The vision has to be clarified. Airstrikes alone cannot win the war. They are effective, they are helpful, but you have to have troops on the ground. As far as we are concerned, we have the Peshmergas who are the boots on the ground, but we need heavy weapons in order to be able to face them. But for example, even in comparison with jet fighters and Apache helicopters, the Apache helicopters would be much more effective in such kind of battle than the airstrikes alone, because in the last 2-3 months they got used to it and they are adapting their movement. They have changed their strategy. The way that they had convoys coming into places, now it's different. Sometimes they are using taxis, pickups, not the usual Humvees and tanks that they had. Therefore, we have to think about adapting a new strategy that would go in line with the change that they have made to avoid the airstrikes. But as Kurdistan is not alone. We have the rest of Iraq with us. Unless we have partners from the Iraqi army, we cannot win the battle alone, even if we do that. But if there is instability in the rest of Iraq, they would have the supply line and they would pose a threat to us. In addition, we have to think about Syria as well.
Yes, it's a very, very complicated, very complex war and a very dangerous war. And in fact, your comments, you answered the first question by saying you believe winning is possible. And you touched on what Janice Stein has looked at in her essay, which is basically that they're using civilians, bringing civilians into Kobani, although it was emptied of most civilians, and which is what the Turks say, emptied of most civilians, but trying to draw the air forces into bombing areas, which would cause civilian casualties and in fact turn the narrative against the war. Before I bring in Irakli to bring in a different part of the world, I just want to open up if anyone has any particular questions that they'd like to ask about, both in terms of the example we have of an asymmetric war in our time, being fought both in Iraq and in Syria, and also that we've heard very strong comments from two generals about how they look at the doctrinal issues when it comes to preparing armies to fight these sorts of battles.
I don't know if you were going to talk about that, but another example would be the kind of war that happened between Israel and Hamas this late summer in terms of different types of definitions of what is to win and what is to lose, and how to use the public opinion of the world and social media, basically by attracting bombings into civilian areas and populations. I don't know if anyone could comment about that.
Yes, let's keep that one, because that is a very good example of how each side blames the other for the rising civilian toll. Yes, Jill?
Yes, hi, Jill Doherty. Hi, Lisa. I have a question. If you would define what's going on in Ukraine right now as asymmetric war, because after all, you have Russian forces, it is believed, going in not in uniforms of the Russian Federation and carrying out operations that aren't overtly military coming from Russia. So the question is, do you define it that way? And also, how do you counter military action like that?
Okay, so let's keep Gaza, let's keep Ukraine, and Irakli is going to speak in a minute. Does anyone have any questions in particular they want to, and I think Assad wants to ask, and then we'll come to those different examples. Samir.
Thank you very much. My name is Samir Al-Taki. I'm from Syria. I think I was surprised really to notice that nobody mentioned politics here. And everything is about muscles, but some values. We spoke a bit about values. I think the bias in understanding values, in treating them, is one of the main source of grievances and what is pushing people to become members of ISIS or support ISIS in Syria is about values. Thank you.
How would you describe, explain what you mean values when it comes to
I meant when you use chemical weapons in Syria and there is no punishment. And now for some areas there is an intervention because of international situation, then the values emerge. So the bias of the international community regarding what's going on has created really a climate where people do not believe that the international committee is committed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So it gives rise to another findings, although whether it explains the brutality of it. Yes, please, Gal.
Yes, Gal Luft from Washington. I just want to pick up on something that General Palomeros said, that he thinks that rules of law are sufficient and just need to be implemented properly. But we're operating under a system that is this year going to be 150 years old, going back to the first Geneva Convention. And this system, while warfare has evolved numerous times, hasn't really caught up with the changes in warfare. And I'm asking it particularly in light of the fact that we are moving more and more into the era of cyber warfare, which completely changes the dynamics of who's a combatant, what can be done, what cannot. But by definition, the old system was about separating combatants from civilians. In the cyber era, you cannot separate the two. Not only because the receiving end are civilians, but also because in many cases the perpetrators, the combatants are going to be civilians. Google today can declare war against China should they want, and they may decide war, which is a non-state actor. And there are many other groups that could do some very, very impressive so-called military, quasi-military operation in the cyber era without the government even being able to monitor it.
Okay, let's bring this back to General Palermo's. You talked about the rules of war being forged a very long time ago.
Well, let's remember that 1949, those laws of armed conflicts and 1977 have been based upon the values. And I would agree and I would not agree with this question of values. I stress the fact that our alliance as it is today has been built upon the values, around the values. And this is the great question you ask. Are we building coalitions of circumstances, or are we building coalitions of willing, commitment, and values? And perhaps we are seeing, hopefully, a turning point in the approach with what happens mainly in Iraq, in Syria. Because we have not been able to learn the lessons from neither the Balkans nor Libya, perhaps more in Afghanistan. I will be very keen to come back on Afghanistan. It's a fascinating case, if I may say so. So I think that the values are still there. This perspective of the 1949 founders of this world order of humanism is still there. We have to adapt, obviously, but cyber is not so much about this question. It's how our society adapt to a more global, a more interconnected, interdependent world, and how we fix the rules of the functioning of our society and the relationship. But I think that the laws of armed conflicts are the overarching rely on the overarching principle of human society. So we should strive, in my perspective, to keep that in line. Whatever, when we have the new tools, the new domains, the new global commands, cyber, space, biology, and many others to come, I would say, let's try to keep those lines.
But it is a very good question, very positive, because wasn't it in Syria that Obama said he would remove some of the directives regarding civilian casualties and some of the air raids there because of the nature of the threat and the way Islamic State was embedding in neighborhoods. I'm going to bring in now Irakli to give us a perspective from Ukraine and, of course, more broadly speaking, in the Caucasus, because it's a bit of we discussed earlier, it's hybrid. In some cases, it does seem more like asymmetric war. In others, it's, but really, in all but name alone, between states. And is winning possible, of course, it's a very opposite question right now in the region.
Well, thank you. I think, first of all, we all acknowledge that this confrontation and conflict will go on forever, because this is really a value-based confrontation. What we believe in Western societies and the liberal democracies, they are totally against that. So this is why I think that
so winning is not possible.
Calibrating what winning is, I think for us the winning should be creating the conditions when we can support the countries to develop their economy, to develop their democracy, actually to state build them. But these conditions need to be met by degrading the offensive posture of the non-state actors like ISIL and others. And Georgia is a very good case in that, because we've been, for 20 years now since regaining independence, we've been attacked by the asymmetric warfare, by the hybrid warfare in Abkhazia, in Skhelvati region throughout the 20 years. I mean, 2008 was a vivid example how the creation of the separatist regimes helped to give the pretext to Russia to roll in the tanks. The same thing is happening. I will now build on what Jill was saying. I mean, the Ukraine and the hybrid warfare, it's now on a completely different level. And I think while we are facing the fundamentalism and radicalism, we're also facing now the imperial fundamentalism from Russian Federation, which are actually trying to make sure that their near border is unstable, undemocratic, so they can lever and have the influence over. So how we should deal with this? I mean, Georgia also is an example of success, I think. First of all, I remember in 2001, 2, 3, I was also head of counterterrorism in Georgia, and I remember the first thing that happened, the United States trained our troops to back up our counterterrorism operations. It was train and equip program, which proved to be very successful. I think all the other projects now we are seeing in Iraq, in Afghanistan, is kind of duplication and more sophistication of that projects. And what we're seeing in Afghanistan, while Georgia is also one of the biggest troop contributors there, because we learned, because we were trained, and we can now helpful to the NATO to really change the situation on the ground in Afghanistan. What we have in Afghanistan 10 years from the war is really a success. Of course we have problems there, but the main thing is that now country is governed, country has its own armed forces, country has its own security forces, and we're all very glad that we were part of it. So now getting back to...
But the war hasn't ended there, to take up your first point. There's still a war going on, called asymmetric. The Taliban are still attacking in the majority of provinces.
I think what the general was saying, the training is, of course, a lot has to do with winning and creating better conditions. But I think what we need to we have to get better on the intelligence side. And human intelligence was always a problem for years now, and we need to get better. We need to know things in advance as much as we can predict our actions as well. Now in Ukraine, I think it's important to understand that what makes now Russia's moves more aggressive and more kind of aggressive in posture is also that the willingness they're demonstrating that they will use force. So they've shown this in Georgia, they've shown this in other parts, they've shown this in Ukraine for a year. I think the only way to counter this is not only the economic and financial sanctions, which is very important to have in place, and we are very glad and reassured from Georgia's perspective when we see this cross-Atlantic unity of the United States, the European Union on that. But at the same time, if we're not going to put military deterrent on the ground, and in partner countries like Georgia and Ukraine and Moldova, of course it's important to assure the eastern part of the NATO alliance, what the alliance is doing after the World Summit. But if you're not going to put the military deterrent, which is giving the capabilities of those countries and to those armies to defend themselves, we will not stop this aggression. We will not stop that fundamentalism that is growing, and it's not showing any sign to back off.
But it's interesting because Samir's point, and obviously in a very, very different context, about how the politics of the war is also fueling, anger on either sides, whether it's politics from Kiev or politics from Moscow. It is part of what is fueling the conflict.
Well, politics in general, I mean, when the country is not democratic, country is corrupt, and I'm not saying that these countries are such, for example, but in general, this economic and social degradation creates the better environment for more grievances, for more confrontation. But this is just the elements of this. The main thing is that we have fundamental differences of understanding how we should go about living in this world with Russians at this point and with the ISIL and other organizations. And we better get more organized in actually getting our side of the military, economical, and military deterrent, economical sanctions, financial sanctions, and of course propaganda. Propaganda has to do a lot with what's going now. I mean, the ISIL's propaganda is a little bit different, more brutal, more, what they were doing and distributing is, of course, is sickening, but also it has its own effect. That's why they're doing this. And the Russian propaganda is completely different, but very effective as well, because changing, whole narrative that they're bringing about is that they're defending the Christian values, they're defending the values against the Western people that are now advocating the liberal democracy. This will be degrading for the old Soviet Union, the Christian Orthodox side. So all of these are the things that we need to be more proactive. I think the propaganda machine, or as we say, the media campaign from our side should be really better off because we're lagging on that.
But beginning with your point about how winning is not possible, I mean, it was that region, the Caucasus, which came out with this idea of frozen conflicts which have no solution in sight. I want to bring you back in, General Perkins, because we had a comment about a war in that part of the world, very different kind of war, a war without end. We heard from Fatih that he thought winning was possible, but I think everyone in this room would agree that if his winning is possible, we don't know what it would look like, and it will take a very long time. Do you think, when you sit down to think about the future of the American Army, are these wars, do you think the American Army is going to be involved in one way or another for a for the foreseeable future?
Yeah. Well, interesting, the question, winning, is it possible? I would say not only is it possible, but my experience is it's desirable. I mean, I've yet to be asked to sit on a panel entitled Losing a Noble National Goal. But it really is.
But what does victory look like?
Yeah, like a lot of these folks said, winning is by the fact, it's an active verb. It is constant. It is a measure of persistent and consistent focus and activity. And so we talk, is this an asymmetric war or not? As I said, from our point of view, all war is asymmetric. War is a battle of asymmetries. You don't have war without asymmetries, generally speaking. And so what happens is, as we just laid out here, with the Peshmerga and the Kurdish forces, you have a series of plans, but you have to link them together with a strategy, which is this consistent and persistent view of it. So you said if we have coalition air forces, which are good at acquiring and targeting Humvees, what the enemy does to say, well, okay, that is an advantage they have. I'm going to asymmetrically look at this, and I'm going to stop driving around in Humvees and go to pickup trucks. In other words, if you can target me, I'll stop being a target. I'll do something else. And so what we say in our doctrine, to win, you have to have multiple dilemmas to the enemy. Because you have to realize that, again, war is defined as a battle of asymmetries. Something will work for a while, then it's not going to work. Do you have something else? Multiple dilemmas. The gentleman up here talking about, does politics complicate war? War is about politics. To quote Clausewitz, which is always safe in a military environment, war is an extension of politics by other means. That if you don't have war without politics. So again, you don't have war without asymmetry. So they don't complicate it, they define it. And so then when you take a look at, okay, how am I going to win? It is a constant push on that. And we define winning is to seize, retain, and exploit the initiative to always be in a position of relative advantage. So that means to be at a position of relative advantage politically, a relative advantage tactically, a relative advantage when it comes to the information campaign, a relative advantage when it comes to the desires of the indigenous population you're working with. And so a strategy is to take all these components of war, the political part of it, the military part of it, the informational part of it, and have a series of dilemmas in figuring out in each case how you maintaining a position of relative advantage constantly. So there really is never an end to it. And that's why I think it's appropriate to say winning. It's constant winning. It's never done.
But whether it's to take General Palermo, but that perhaps winning is the wrong thing, but not losing, because just take, we're talking about the Daesh or Islamic State. I mean, those ideas go back in a different form to the last century in Iraq. There was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, then it became ISIS, then it became Islamic State. And now in the region, sadly, they talk about the son of ISIS, that it will constantly be there. And because of the way in the asymmetric battles, it's a question of computer, it's a question of brutal videos, it's gaining the advantage in terms of the propaganda war. You're going to be constantly on the back foot.
And that is what, the U.S. Army just put out an operating concept. We have come to grips with that the future is unknown and unknowable, and you are constantly going to be under some type of pressure with people who have different politics, who have different end states. It's constant. And so this thought that if you look historically, sometimes we ebb and flow with regards to capability of militaries, with regards to our focus on this, that never works out well. It's the ability to consistently and persistently be on this and maintain that capability and focus on winning, not coping, winning. Which means you've got to figure out what is the position of advantage each time, and then you have to resource that. And that requires commitment, it requires time, energy, et cetera, because your adversaries are not going to stop.
Are we back to Rumsfeldian known unknowns? General Palermo, you wanted to come in.
Yes, I think this question of winning is obviously fundamental. We can win on the short term and lose on the long term, and vice versa. I would argue that in the Balkans we lost a lot when we accepted the overrun of safe areas, UN security safe areas.
That's Srebrenica.
Yeah, 20 years from now. But in the middle term, when we decided to enforce peace, we won a fragile peace, Dayton agreements, but we are still to win the hearts and minds if we really want to win the battle in the Balkans and to integrate those nations in our world, to make sure that we are, as we did in Europe after the Second World War, we are able to extend, I would say, the values, but the ability of the people to take care of themselves and to decide their future.
You mentioned Afghanistan. It's interesting because now, after what's happened in Iraq, it's given pause for thought to many, especially I think in the United States. And I think this might have been behind Obama's move to keep the American army there to fight combat roles against not just Al-Qaeda, but also the Taliban. And NATO may be in a position to have to come back again if the threats rise there again. Obviously, we hope they don't, but they could. General Palermo.
Well, in the military terms, and David would agree with me, I'm sure, you don't advertise on what you will do in 2 years' time. So you must be cautious.
You don't know what you will have to do in 2 years' time. That's
you have your plans, your vision. I mean, we always advocated on keeping presence, keeping our will, keeping our commitment in Afghanistan. A lot of people 1 year ago, I would call that the prophets of doom. They said that was not feasible, that the transition was not feasible, not envisageable, that it will not work, obviously, that the political transition in Afghanistan will not be there. Not everything is solved, but we are going for the next phase. We are transitioning. The Afghan forces are doing better and better every day. They are gaining skills. They are courageous. They are committing themselves. And we see the transition coming. So let's commit ourselves for the resolute support mission, training, advice, assist. That could be the most wonderful success of one coalition for many, many years. And it is really worthy because the alternative is terrible.
We may well...
Coming back to ISIS, ISIS now controls the territory. It's about 250,000 square kilometers. It has a population under its rule, and it's running the administration in these areas.
Very different from Al-Qaeda. Very
different from Al-Qaeda. But the point is that what to do? We have to have a short-term strategy in order to win this battle, and it's winnable. We can win. But the point is how to stop it. This is where we need a long-term strategy, but also cooperation between the regional powers and the international actors. We know that there has been a lot of support in terms of providing logistics for these people, for these foreign fighters to come into Syria and to be there fighting us. We know that there has been a lot of financial resources that have been provided for ISIS. Where did they come from? Now they are able to sell the oil that they are controlling in the western part of Iraq and in the eastern part of Syria. So these are the things that we can work together to stop the logistic support, stop their access, stop the financial support that they're getting, and also to do something in order to stop the recruitment that is coming from all over the world. Therefore, intelligence sharing, intelligence sharing is important between the countries, and also a clear commitment from these countries that they want to do it. And also in the long term, we have to think about building some kind of understanding between the religions, because the terrorist organization of the Islamic State came and declared the reinstallment of the Islamic Caliphate. They have a map, and they have an ideology, and they have got a roadmap. Where do they want to go? They don't accept anybody else. We have suffered a lot in Iraqi Kurdistan because we are defending the rights of minorities. They came to the Yazidis, asked them to convert or to be killed. This is where they beheaded people, they enslaved their women, they enslaved their children, and sold them in the open market. The very old concepts that were there in the medieval ages. So we have to find a common ground for us, for those who fight for values, who share something in order to work together. But we have to be realistic. It is within a context. It's in the Middle East. We have the Shia-Sunni power struggle. We have got the Saudi Arabia and Iran power struggle. Turkey, Iran power struggle, the spheres of influence between all these players. So it's not an isolated event that we have to deal with. A number of factors and elements have to be taken into consideration.
Yes, levels and levels. So before we go on, I think we have about 10, 15 minutes left. I don't want to leave hanging in the air that two people brought up Gaza, the Israel-Gaza war, and some of the images were used in the screen. And I think it's very much what Janice Stein, I think, was thinking of, at least it was one of the wars that she discussed, about how warring parties are drawn into violating the laws of war and then try to blame the other side to claim legitimacy and be seen to winning the war. And Gaza, Israel-Hamas was a key example where Israel would fire at an area, civilians would die. They would say, well, Hamas was firing rockets from there, the fighters were there. Hamas would say there were no rockets, no fighters. Israel is targeting civilians, high civilian death toll. Similarly, in Syria, President Assad will use his barrel bombs, will lay siege to areas. He's blamed for causing so many civilian casualties, violating the laws of war. But then the Syrian government says, no, it's the terrorists. The terrorists are holding these people hostage. They're to blame for the civilian casualties. So there you have two current wars where both sides are being blamed. And I'm not going to get into which side is right or wrong, because there are no angels in war. But does anyone want to, it was raised by two people, whether our panelists or a comment on this, because I think it is a very, very current discussion. And no doubt these kinds of wars are not going to end anytime soon.
Hi, Lise. General Vance, good to see you again. I would like to make a comment on this because I think it's germane to the discussion. So General Vance, Commander Joint Operations Command. I think part of our challenge here, as you've heard, and I just sort of play off of what General Perkins was saying, is one thing that makes asymmetry more pronounced than simply the offset of capabilities is who owns it. Whose is it? And we tend to look at the world because we have an expeditionary element to how we operate, and we try and bring effective responses outside of our countries to other countries. And therefore, we tend to internalize and own the problem, when in fact, much of the asymmetry stems from, whether it's the politics or the nature of the very nature of the conflict itself, it is owned by somebody else. So we can sit here and try and wrestle with means to alter the situation in Syria, but ultimately much of the asymmetry is generated and created by the very nature of the conflict inside that country. And so to come from the outside and go in to try and put a solution in place just adds to the overall asymmetrical effect. And we felt this in Afghanistan. I mean, we brought best practices to bear across the range of counterinsurgency techniques, but the asymmetry was largely generated by the inability of the thing that actually solves an insurgency is effective governance, and the people being the prize. Ultimately, the politics of it, it didn't match. So not only were we facing, we wonder why were we facing people with AK-47s and IEDs, and we had everything else. Well, the Iraqi or the Afghan army should have dealt with that, but they couldn't because the wider political piece, the real asymmetry, we could not paper over that. And so I think it's worthwhile as a comment, I think, just to understand that much of the asymmetry is founded upon the fact that we may be trying to bring things to bear, bring support, resolution capabilities to bear in an environment that is largely hostile to that or has antibodies to that. And no matter how hard we try, it is difficult. So is winning possible? Absolutely, but we must address that top end piece of where the asymmetry often stems from.
But Afghanistan is interesting because those of you who will follow it closely, you'll know the impact of the word often used by the Americans, spectacular. A spectacular suicide bombing in the heart of Kabul can somehow shift the perception that even though the Afghan army working with its coalition partners may be winning in the provinces, a spectacular attack, to use the phrase, in Kabul will somehow worry Afghans, frighten Afghans that the Taliban are winning. It's the perception of the war as opposed to the actual reality of the war that isn't as much in the public mind. And that is I think it's a very key part of asymmetric warfare, that someone just straps bombs to himself, and they are getting more and more sophisticated as well. Can I ask you, if I don't know how you want to enter into it, you went into Syria to say that this is something that's in the nature of the Syrian war, but of course the discussion now in Western capitals who want to help the Syrian opposition is they have to change the military balance in this asymmetric war, arm the so-called moderate Syrian opposition to put military pressure on Assad to bring him to the table. How do you see that? Because you seem to almost imply that wasn't an issue that was under discussion now in terms of changing that balance in this asymmetric conflict.
Right. Well, not being one of your panelists, I don't want to take up too much time here.
Well, you raised it, so.
But I think that in studying the question that you've posed, is winning possible in this asymmetric environment? As we consider what we do or not in Syria, the nature of the moderate opposition. What is their nature? How porous are they on the fringes or on the edges of that movement versus the regime versus ISIS or ISIL inside? So we will go in. We are naturally poised and programmed to go in with fixes, with capabilities, with capacity, and I think we will apply them expertly, as we always do. But we need to make certain that there's fertile ground for that, the cumulative effect of that application of force or goodwill or whatever it is, that it actually takes root amongst the people and the nation recovers. And absent that calculus, that dynamic, we can put all of the efforts that we want into something, and we will only paper it over, and or we won't have the time actually to see it succeed.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, thanks. My name is Jackie O'Neill. I'm the director of the Institute for Inclusive Security. My question is for General Perkins. You have a fascinating job, obviously, in hiring the U.S. military. And as you were saying, preparing it for both to create forces or sources of asymmetry and also to respond to them. And a lot of the debate around military intervention and ISIS and ISIL in this country, in Canada and the U.S., has been on airstrikes versus boots on the ground, as though it was a binary option, and boots on the ground was sort of one prepackaged set of interventions that we might make. And I'm wondering, my question for you is, looking forward, what do you think are the most fundamental gaps in capacity or most particularly in force structure of the U.S. military as it stands right now, as it's needed to respond to some of these gaps that we might then face in an asymmetrical situation on the ground where we have personnel that have very limited and disparate levels of access to people in the local population, ability to understand various contexts, some of the diversity that was just raised, and how can we be preparing our force structure so that we have the flexibility in place to gather the human intelligence, to gather all sorts of other sources of potentially winning that don't require simply equipment. Thank you.
Well, great question. In fact, we actually address that somewhat directly, our new concept we just put out, because we say to win, because that's what we say, win in a complex world. That's what the United States Army is focused on, winning. Excuse me, is that in this very complex world we're going into, you have to deliver not only firepower, which is sometimes when you think of the conventional sense of war, but that's really the tactical operational level, but you win at the strategic level, is that we have to equip the Army as part of the joint force to deliver all elements of national power, not just firepower. Firepower wins a battle, national power wins at the strategic level. So what we have to make sure from the Army's point of view, do we train and develop our leaders to understand all of the elements of national power, including coalitions, the political element, the economic element, all of the joint pieces? Do we build our staff such that all elements of national power can plug into it and you can create a common vision with that? Do we have a level of interoperability, not only within our joint force, but within our coalition forces, so you can leverage all of the other nations and their power so that you can continue to win at the strategic level? Because again, it takes this persistency and consistency there. So we've been very interesting. We just put our concept out 2 weeks ago, and the title is Win in a Complex World. We are focusing on winning, not coping, winning. But we say it requires all elements of national power, which means in some ways we have to look at this differently. It's not just about firepower. And just about everything we brought up here is really highlighting the limits of firepower. I mean, that's what we're finding when you talk about asymmetry, because the U.S. military is very good at that. And so, again, our definition of asymmetry is to maximize your advantage and exploit your enemy's weakness. Well, if the U.S. military is very good at firepower, the dilemma the enemy is going to bring us is one that firepower is probably not that useful against. It should be no surprise. That's why you have to understand that all war is a battle of asymmetries. And therefore, when you come up with multiple dilemmas to provide to the enemy, you kind of go back. I said for asymmetry, you have to have two parts of it. You have to have the ability to leverage your strengths, and you also have to be exploiting your enemy's weakness simultaneously. So we get back to this question of law of warfare. Is a law of warfare an asymmetric issue? I said it's really not. It's not the fact that there is a law about it. It is what do you do with it once you have it? Laws of warfare are not new. The Hittites in the 16th century BC had a pretty well-established protocols of war. One of them was you don't attack during the planting season. So this is not new that there are rules. The issue is how do you enforce them? What do you use them for? And then do the consequences provide an asymmetric advantage? So if somebody says, I'm going to store munitions in a school, okay, well, is that an asymmetric advantage? Depends. Does it leverage your own strength? Well, yes, I have a school. I know it may not be attacked, so that's a strength. Well, how are you exploiting your enemy's weakness? Maybe their weakness is a lack of will to enforce the law. And if it's an international law of war, who has to force it? The international community. So our will or lack of will could be something to be seen to be exploited by the enemy. And so you have to think, I would tell you, much broader about these things sometimes than our conversations lead us down to. So those, quite honestly, those are the challenges I'm just laying out, that as we are designing the future of the U.S. Army, we are designing an Army that can take all of that and then leverage that within its force structure.
Okay, I've got two questions, one in the front and then one here. So let's take two of them just in case they're, and then in the front here.
Hi, Ala Murabit. I'm the founder of the Voice of Libyan Women and advisor to the UN Security Council on Resolution 1325. I think it's been established by the panel and by some of the comments that usually asymmetrical warfare is very much cemented in ideology or value-based. And while I, as someone who probably would not be here had it not been for military intervention in Libya, can understand and appreciate the urgency, I do think that I would like to hear your comments, at least, on the importance of community development and working with community leaders, because as much as military intervention does act very quickly, it's been proven that it's not the key to addressing terrorist and extremist groups. It only further exacerbates the situation through political and security and economic deterioration. And I think the real arms dealers that aren't necessarily represented here are the local community leaders and the women who are supplying these weapons of ideas to communities that desperately need new ideas to listen to and a way to combat these terrorist and extremist groups. And I would just like to hear your input on what you think the role of women, youth, community leaders is in addressing extremist situations around the world. Thank you.
Very good. Let me just keep that question on your mind. It's a very good question. And in the front here, microphone in the front. And please stand up, just so all the viewers can see you.
Sure. Thank you, Lise. Faraz Maqsad from the University of Maryland, an adjunct professor, and also a Middle East watcher from Washington, D.C. I wanted to take a stab at answering the question in the title, which is winning possible? And at least as it relates to ISIS, I don't think that that's possible in the near term. I think what produced Al-Qaeda in the Middle East and then gave us ISIS and what will give us a future radical organization, these forces, these social and political forces, are still not being addressed. In the Middle East today, many of us of my generation had a lot of hope in 2011 with the so-called Arab Spring. We thought that finally change has come to bear in the Middle East. But what we find is that the social and political forces that are churning in that part of the world are not providing the political space that is required for forces of modernity to emerge. And by here, I think you pointed to that quite a bit by saying, the Sunni versus Shia dynamic that is tearing away at that region from Iran on one hand, all the way through the Persian Gulf, the Levant, and even the Maghreb on one hand, but also on the other one, the secular authoritarian regimes versus the religious establishments and the mullahs. And so we find that the forces of modernity in that part of the world, who are the natural combatants against the radicals of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and whatnot, are not given a chance. And when we think that we could try and deal with the situation with a few airstrikes here and a few airstrikes there, there's no chance of winning when you look at the situation from that perspective. I'd like to get the comments from the audience about how do we deal with these churning political forces and try to put together a stable political solution to that part of the world, something that the U.S. has failed to do in Afghanistan and also failed to do in Iraq.
Okay. No chance of winning. Let me just get a show of hands before we come back to the panel. Let's take the life of an administration, 5 years. How many here believe that there is a good chance of winning, as you would define it, against, let's say, the threat posed by the so-called Islamic State in the next 5 years, that winning is possible? With a show of hands, just so we get a sense of what... Oh, sorry. And not possible? I think there's more. And no, don't know? What's that?
10 years, you'll get one.
Oh, that's two-term president, right? So, 10 years. Okay, let's. I think Allah made the question, because that is the question about whether the insurgency or the war comes back. Who would like to? Iraqi, you haven't let you come because you're in the frozen conflict area.
Well, I fully agree. With the importance of working with the local communities. Even in Afghanistan, when our troops were operating in Helmand province, the areas where they were more interacting with local community leaders, talking with them, explaining the less tax and less hostility they were getting from the environment. So definitely we have to be more focused on the local communities. In Georgia's experience as well, as in early 90s when we regained the independence and there was a Russian-inspired and backed separatist, we lost that moment when we had to do more talks with the local communities in Tskhinvali or in Abkhazia, for example, and we missed the opportunity to make them part of the new, better, independent Georgia. And we learned now from our hard mistakes. And what we're doing right now, we have a policy of engagement with the societies in Abkhazia and Skhinvali region, making the community work, making the economics and the trade more kind of prominent suggestion from our side, rather than only talk about the technical unification. So I think the only way to go forward, I mean, war is the extension of the politics, and it's the tools of the politics. And of course, we need to deal with this militarily. But at the same time, creating the environment for reconciliation only can be done through these community interactions. And just one last point I want to make is that we have to be consistent. We have to learn from our own past mistakes, like, for example, in giving the support to the community or country that has a dictatorship and there is the opposition, and we were hesitant to provide lethal weapons to them. Look what it turned out. The same thing. We're now, it's hard for me to understand almost a year after the conflict and aggression in Ukraine, we're still thinking about whether to provide the lethal weapons to Ukrainians. And this is not consistent. And we have to bear in mind that this is exactly the things that will encourage the opponent. This is the way they're going to see that there's a green line, because the West is talking and not acting on the ground, while others are creating the reality, then eyeing the new target, and force the West to forget about what they already did, like in Crimea, and then focusing on other targets when I don't think can be saved if we're not going to be very forthcoming and very solid in providing the deterrent, military deterrent on the ground.
This is a note to NATO, isn't it? 1 year to the day yesterday since the protests started, and NATO still's not. But you could come in on this too, on Ala's question, because it said that Mosul was not a military victory for ISIS. It fell because people supported them, because it was against corruption, lack of security, that people were fed up.
Indeed, I will combine both questions. The Arab Spring and the revolutions were hijacked. Okay? The uprising started, but there was no leadership to lead and to bring it about to the safe side. Therefore, they were hijacked by the Islamists, who took control and created a lot of sensitivities and nervousness. But what happened in Iraq was as a result of the wrong policies of the former prime minister in Iraq, by marginalizing the Sunnis, by monopolizing the power, by excluding them from the political process. Therefore, they provided a safe haven for these terrorists to establish a base and then to grow and expand. Therefore, when ISIS started, it was unbelievable for a limited number of troops to be able to defeat 6 units, 6 divisions of the Iraqi army, armed and equipped with the best advanced weapons of the Americans. So therefore, the point was that the society opened the door and helped ISIS to achieve its objective, because they were so much fed up with Maliki and its policies. So therefore, the point is that people did not support, but because they were so much fed up, they opened the door. They were expecting that it would be different, because there were a number of groups that were fighting under the umbrella of ISIS. It was not ISIS alone. There were a number of others, but when ISIS came, it took control of the thing. And indeed, Kurdistan region succeeded in the Kurdish Spring started in 1991. We live in a difficult neighborhood. We were able, because we were determined to make it a success, and we had a clear vision what do we want to achieve. Therefore, even talking about the Syria war, there was a front that wanted the regime to stay. There was another front that wanted the regime to go, but did not have the tools and did not want to engage. And wars cannot be won by statements and concepts. Wars can only be won when you will be engaged and you would have a roadmap in order to do it. The society is playing a role and can play a role, and we have seen it. In Iraq, Kurdistan is stable, safe, secure. We have encouraged foreign direct investment. Airlines are flying in and out of Kurdistan. Airlines are not going to Baghdad. The companies are not going to invest, because we have stability. People are supportive of what the government has done. Therefore, we need to have determination. We need to have a strong resolve to win the wars, not just to talk big and do nothing.
Talk big and do nothing. Oh, we're coming to an end shortly. That's hanging in the air, no chance of winning. General Palemas and General Perkins, do you want to respond to that? And could I just drop one last idea into this conversation, Lisa, take away for you? And again, I'm going back to Janice Stein's paper, because she raised a very interesting proposal. And since there's politicians as well as military people and civil society people in this room, she raised the question about the laws of war and saying perhaps there has to be a change in the laws of war if these groups and these asymmetric battles are going to put weapons in schools and hospitals, and they become attacked, it is a violation of the laws of war to attack civilians at a time of conflict. But should there be a new law, and Genesis, I don't know whether you want to raise it, that the law should also say it's also illegal to put weapons in those areas so that they draw this kind of fire. Janet, do you want to just make a quick point? Because there's been an assumption here that we have the laws of war, which have been around since time immemorial. With the microphone, please, and if you could stand so we could see your nice red glasses.
Thank you. I think the broader issue that I raised, and I think people are struggling with indirectly one way or the other, there's certainly a different standard with respect to impunity, right? And when groups reject the validity of the laws of war entirely, as some do in asymmetric conflict, and we use different standards then to measure and to sanction those who violate. The laws are there by implication, but there are vast differences in the standards that we use, and that itself is a problem and is victimizing civilians.
Okay. I didn't want to leave this session without that being placed. No chance of winning. General Palermo's.
Well, I was lucky, fortunate to take part in the Wales Summit for NATO head of states. Those were not only the NATO head of states, the 28, but plus a lot of partners. I would say around 60 head of states and government together. And they really addressed all the questions of today, which is really a good news. And they addressed that in a very open, very wide perspective. And you can feel, really, you could feel the solidarity and the commitment of these people. So I think we have a chance to win, but we have really to address more and better the roots of the problems, because today we are forced to address the symptoms. They are terrible, but still we address the symptoms. And I would agree that linking with community, building those networks of excellence, expertise, understanding is the key. We need to fight together for a common goal and to redefine the meaning of our commitment. It was very clear after the Second World War. It's more blurred today because of the many different the divergence between values and interests, perhaps. And we have still borders. We pretend we live in a world without borders, but we have still borders. So how we make sure that we can address together all these fundamental questions while keeping in mind that we must find for our values with our values. We cannot compromise with that. And we must start at home. We discussed about the battle for narrative. This is true that we are losing the battle for our narrative. And this is the point and the difficulty and the risk in democracies. We want a very open debate, and this is fine. But we need as well to focus more and more the education, the attention on the real issues for the future, for future generations, which is our ability, our will to fight together, to win together, and to keep this world moving together.
Okay, General Perkins?
Yeah, so just to be clear, put me down in the pro-win category. I'm all for winning. But
it's a good team to be on.
Yeah, so I'm a big advocate of that. What you would do, though, is you have to understand what creates a win, and you have to understand war. Both the panel members here, we've talked about before, war is an extension of politics. So I found in war is a series of temporary conditions. That's what it's a series of temporary conditions. It is always changing. Somebody is always looking for a level of asymmetry. They're always looking to maximize their advantage and exploit your weakness. So in war, we have both, it's generally a political endeavor with a military component. And so those two parts have to work together. What the military part is interesting when we say, can we win war? We always look to people dressed like me in a uniform. Well, we're just one component, quite honestly, a subcomponent of it. What the military can do is we can provide a level of security for a period of time, because war is a series of temporary conditions, to let the political aspect come to some level of resolution. But it's not indefinite. And so as a military may provide a period of security so that political accommodation can occur outside of kinetic activity, but if that is not taken advantage of, somebody is going to exploit it. So it's constantly that way. If one part of the war-winning machine, let's say in this part, the political part of it, does not take advantage of the opportunity that the military has provided at a level of security, someone is going to exploit that weakness to their advantage. That is the definition, our definition of asymmetry. So again, not to get too historically specific, but when the U.S. military left Iraq, it was at a relatively historic low level of violence. So that was an opportunity that someone could either take advantage of or exploit. And I'll leave it at that.
Ladies and gentlemen, we began with a question, is winning possible? We heard from the floor, there's no chance of winning. We heard from General Palermo's, there is a chance to win if we fight with our values and for our values. We heard from General Perkins to say, not just we have a chance to win, we will win if all the pieces are in place, both military and political. And from Irakli and Fateh, not surprising, as politicians, we must win. These are wars that must be won. Let me leave you with the mantra of the Pentagon, since these are wars of our time, which says, hope is not a strategy. And may you all find the ammunition and the information in the next sessions to come about how to win in the war that you feel must be won. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us.